Billions of dollars of taxpayer TARP dollars have wound up in the hands of companies and individuals it was never intended for.
Our next guest says all this should come as no surprise, really. Dan Mitchell, senior fellow at the Cato Institute, joins us now. Dan, we've seen it before. Wherever government gets that involved in financial affairs in the private sector, you see mismanagement.
Well, this is a typical government boondoggle, I suppose you could call it. But the key thing to remember is you go back to, September of 2008, the legislation that authorized, that created TARP was a blank check. In effect, Bush and Paulson and now Obama and Geithner had free rein to do whatever they want. And so it shouldn't be any surprise that we're seeing things that, stink to high heaven in terms of corruption, money going overseas. The politicians got what they wanted, which was unlimited authority, and so they're playing it for all it's worth.
Yeah. You know, Dan, you say stink to high heaven. Congressman Lynch, a Democrat out of Florida, used those very words when he asked for Tim Geithner's resignation earlier in the year over these similar AIG findings. And, Dan, what we found out then, and this may make your head explode, and that is this. When AIG, and this is why this money went out the back door, the government's back door to these foreign banks, when AIG got that credit line from the government, Timothy Geithner said, look, that's when the government became a creditor, and it didn't have any firepower or had no standing to tell these guys, look, you have to take a haircut on your trades with AIG. Callion, all the Societe Generale said, look, we're standing pat. We want 100% remuneration on the trades. Now, what do you make of that in terms of government bailouts?
Well, it's simple incentives. Imagine if I owed you $100 and I had no money, and all of a sudden David said, Dan, I'm going to stand behind you for all your debts. Well, all of a sudden you would expect me to give you that $100 and you wouldn't negotiate a new deal at all. Ultimately, what this whole TARP debacle shows us is that we never should have done a bailout in the first place. We should have taken a more responsible approach like was taken 20 years ago with the savings and loan, where, yes, taxpayer money was involved, but the money was used to actually liquidate and shut down the bankrupt institutions, not this corrupt deal where the big firms that gave a lot of money to the politicians wound up then collecting a lot of money from the taxpayers. That's what upsets a lot of Americans, and it still should.
And, Dan, there is no guarantee that this financial regulation bill would stop the same thing from happening again, correct?
Oh, not at all. That's what's really frustrating about this. It's one thing to go ahead and make a dumb mistake and have the taxpayers pick up a big tab, but nowhere in Obama's bailout legislation was there any reform of the Federal Reserve, which provided all the excess liquidity. Nowhere was there anything done to shut down and liquidate the government-created entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that did so much to inflate the housing bubble. Right. And so we're actually setting the stage to make things worse in the future.
You know, I tell you, Dan, and the government was making up rules as it went along through the bailout. Why Tim Geithner couldn't say, this is a new rule, you're not going to get 100% on the dollar, it is beyond me, and it's beyond the taxpayer, it's beyond the viewing public. But Dan Mitchell, senior fellow at the Cato Institute, really good to be with you today,
Thank you,
sir.
Dan.
Thank you.